Imagine a camera pulling back over the Atlantic Ocean. The year is 1588. A line of ink traces itself across parchment, stretching from the port of Lisbon, curving south past the Canary Islands, catching the trade winds, and arcing westward across open water toward the Caribbean. Now another line appears. This one begins in Seville, cuts through the Strait of Gibraltar, and pushes deep into the Mediterranean. And then another. Acapulco to Manila, a thin red thread connecting two continents across the largest ocean on the planet, a journey of 10,000 miles with nothing but water, wind, and sky between departure and arrival. Every single one of those lines, every route, every crossing, every treasure fleet and colonial supply chain that held together the dominant empires on Earth depended on one ship. Not a fleet of different designs, not a rotating cast of experimental vessels. One type of ship refined over decades, engineered with such precision that dominated the world's oceans for nearly 200 years. The Galleon. And the thing everyone gets wrong about galleons is that they think of them as pirate ships. They picture skull and crossbone flags, Jack Sparrow swinging from ropes, cannons blasting through wooden hulls. But galleons weren't pirate ships. They were the ships pirates were terrified of. They were floating fortresses, cargo haulers, warships, and engineering marvels, all packed into a single wooden frame. And the story of how they were designed, built, and perfected is one of the most underrated engineering stories in human history. To understand where the galleon came from, you need to understand the problem it was built to solve. In the early 1500s, European powers had a crisis. They had discovered new worlds. They had mapped coastlines from Brazil to the Philippines. They had established colonies, trade routes, and extraction operations that were pulling gold, silver, spices, and silk from every corner of the globe. But they had no ship capable of doing all three things those operations demanded. They needed a vessel that could carry enormous quantities of cargo across open ocean. They needed that vessel to defend itself against enemy warships and pirates. And they needed it to survive storms, calms, and months at sea without falling apart. The ships they had at the time could do one or two of those things, but never all three. The carrack was the workhorse of the age of exploration. Columbus sailed carracks. Vasco da Gama sailed carracks. They were big, round-hulled cargo carriers with tall castle structures fore and aft. They could haul tons of goods, and those raised platforms gave soldiers a height advantage in combat. But carracks were slow and clumsy in rough seas. Their high castles caught the wind like sails themselves, making them drift sideways in crosswinds. And their round hulls rolled badly in heavy swells. On the other end of the spectrum, you had the caravel. Small, fast, nimble. Caravels could sail closer to the wind than almost anything else afloat. They were perfect for exploration, for darting along coastlines, for scouting harbors and river mouths. But they were too small to carry meaningful cargo, too lightly built to absorb cannon fire, and too cramped to support crews on voyages lasting months. What Spain and Portugal needed was a hybrid. Something with the cargo capacity of a carrack, the sailing performance of a caravel, and the firepower to hold its own in a naval battle. That hybrid was the galleon. The earliest galleons appeared in the 1530s, and they were immediately different from anything that had come before. The most obvious change was the hull shape. Galleons were longer relative to their width than carracks. Where a carrack might have a length-to-beam ratio of about 2.5 to 1, a galleon stretched that to 3 to 1, sometimes even 4 to 1 in later designs. That longer, narrower hull cut through the water more efficiently. It reduced drag, it made the ship faster under sail and far easier to steer, and it allowed the hull to flex with ocean swells rather than fighting them, which made galleons significantly more seaworthy in rough conditions. But the hull shape was just the beginning. The real engineering genius of the galleon was in its structural skeleton. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. Every galleon started with a keel, a single massive timber that ran the entire length of the ship's bottom. This was the spine of the vessel, and selecting the right tree for a keel was a process that could take years. Shipwrights needed straight-grained hardwood, typically oak or teak, with no knots, no curves, no weaknesses. A single flaw in the keel timber could doom the entire ship. Some of the largest galleons had keels over 100 feet long, carved from trees that had been growing for 2 or 3 centuries before they were felled. From the keel, the shipwright built upward with a series of ribs, curved frames that define the cross-sectional shape of the hull. These ribs were spaced roughly 12 to 18 inches apart, each one custom-shaped to give the hull its characteristic profile, wider at the waterline, narrowing below, and tapering inward as it rose to the deck. The ribs weren't single pieces of wood. They were built up from multiple timbers, overlapping and bolted together, because no single tree could provide the complex curves required. The joints were staggered so that no 2 weak points lined up, a principle that modern engineers would recognize as load distribution. Over the ribs went the planking. The hull planks were thick slabs of oak, typically 3 to 4 inches thick on a large galleon, and they were attached to the ribs using a combination of iron bolts and wooden pegs called tree nails. The tree nails were actually preferred in many cases because iron corroded in salt water while wooden pegs swelled when wet, creating tighter joints over time. The seams between planks were caulked with oakum, which was old rope fibers picked apart and soaked in tar, then driven into the gaps with specialized tools. Over the caulking went a layer of pitch or tar to waterproof the entire surface. But water wasn't the only enemy below the waterline. In tropical waters, shipworms were a nightmare. These aren't actually worms at all. They're bivalve mollusks, relatives of clams, that bore into submerged wood and eat it from the inside out. A galleon anchored in Caribbean waters could have its hull riddled with shipworm tunnels within months, turning solid oak planking into something resembling Swiss cheese. The solution was sheathing. Shipwrights covered the underwater portions of the hull with an additional layer of sacrificial planking, sometimes with a gap between the layers filled with animal hair soaked in tar. Later, galleons used lead sheathing, thin sheets of lead nailed over the hull below the waterline, which shipworms couldn't penetrate. The lead also had the benefit of reducing marine growth like barnacles, which slowed the ship. Above the waterline, the galleon's design diverged sharply from its predecessors. The forecastle, that towering structure at the bow of a carrack, was dramatically reduced on the galleon. On a carrack, the forecastle rose high above the main deck, creating a massive wind-catching surface that made the ship nearly impossible to sail into the wind. Galleon designers lowered the forecastle, sometimes eliminating it entirely, creating a bow profile that was sleeker and far easier to handle in headwinds. The sterncastle remained tall, but was redesigned for function rather than grandeur. It housed the captain's quarters, officers' cabins, navigation equipment, and the whipstaff or tiller that controlled the rudder. The sterncastle on a galleon was narrower than a carrack's, and its sides were raked inward, sloping toward the center of the ship as they rose. This reduced the wind profile while still providing the elevated fighting platform that naval tacticians wanted. The deck layout of a galleon was a masterpiece of space management. A typical large galleon had 3 or 4 decks, each serving a specific purpose. The lowest deck, below the waterline, was the hold. This was where cargo was stored, packed in crates, barrels, and bales, secured against movement by wooden bracing and rope lashing. On treasure galleons, the hold was where the gold and silver went, stacked in chests and guarded around the clock. The hold also contained the ballast, tons of stone or gravel placed in the very bottom of the ship to lower its center of gravity and prevent capsizing. Above the hold was the orlop deck, a dim, cramped space that served as additional storage and, on warships, housed the surgeon's quarters. This was where wounded sailors were carried during battle, below the waterline where they were protected from incoming fire, but subjected to darkness, heat, and the ever-present stench of bilge water sloshing beneath them. The gun deck was the galleon's primary weapon platform. This was where the heaviest cannons were mounted, arranged in a row along each side of the ship, with their muzzles pointing outward through square openings in the hull, called gun ports. The gun port was itself an engineering innovation. Before gun ports, cannons were mounted on the upper deck, exposed to weather and waves. The invention of the hinged gun port, usually credited to a French shipwright in the early 1500s, allowed heavy cannons to be placed lower in the ship, closer to the waterline, which improved stability and accuracy while protecting the guns from the elements. When not in use, the ports were closed and sealed against incoming water. During battle, the ports were opened, the cannons run out, and the ship's broadside became a wall of fire. A large galleon could carry between 20 and 70 cannons, depending on its size and purpose. The heaviest guns were culverins and demi-culverins, long-barreled weapons that fired iron or stone balls at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. These were the snipers of naval warfare, designed to punch holes in enemy hulls from a distance. Closer in, you had shorter-barreled cannons like the demi-cannon and the Perrier, which fired heavier shot at shorter ranges, designed to smash through hull planking and create flooding below decks. And for close-quarters defense, there were swivel guns mounted on the rails, small anti-personnel weapons that fired grape shot or scatter ammunition at enemy boarding parties. The weight of all this armament created engineering challenges that galleon builders had to solve. A single culverin could weigh over 4,000 pounds. Mounting dozens of these weapons on a gun deck, along with their carriages, ammunition, and powder charges, put enormous stress on the ship's structure. The gun deck beams had to be massively reinforced. The hull planking around the gun ports was thickened, and the cannons themselves were secured with heavy rope tackles that allowed them to recoil when fired, but prevented them from rolling freely if the ship heeled over in rough seas. A loose cannon on a heaving gun deck could kill sailors, smash through the hull, and sink the ship from the inside. Above the gun deck was the main deck, the primary working space of the ship. This was where the crew handled sails, worked the capstan to raise the anchor, operated pumps to clear bilge water, and performed the 1,000 daily tasks required to keep a sailing ship operational. The main deck was also where the crew slept, ate, and lived during months-long voyages. On a ship carrying 200 or more men, it was a crowded and unpleasant place to spend 3 to 6 months. But the real marvel of the galleon was above all of that: the rigging. A galleon's rig was a network of masts, yards, sails, and ropes so complex that it took years of training just to learn the names of every component. A typical galleon carried 3 masts, though some of the largest had 4. The foremast stood near the bow, the mainmast rose from the center of the ship, and the mizzenmast was positioned toward the stern. Each mast was not a single pole. The lower section, called the lower mast, was the thickest and strongest. Above that, a topmast was attached using a structure called a top, a platform that also served as a fighting position. On later galleons, a third section called the top gallant mast extended even higher. Each mast carried multiple sails. The lower masts carried square sails, large rectangular sheets of canvas that caught the wind from behind and drove the ship forward. These were the primary propulsion sails, the engines of the ship. The largest of them, the mainsail on the mainmast, could be over 40 feet wide and 30 feet tall, requiring dozens of men hauling on ropes to raise, lower, or adjust it. Above the main course, sail hung the topsail, smaller but crucial for fine-tuning speed. And above that, the topgallant sail, used in lighter winds to squeeze every possible knot of speed from gentle breezes. The mizzenmast was different. Instead of a square sail, it carried a lateen sail, a triangular sheet rigged on a long diagonal yard. The lateen sail was the galleon's secret weapon for maneuverability. While the square sails on the fore and mainmasts drove the ship forward, the lateen on the mizzen allowed the helmsman to adjust the ship's direction, to turn tighter, to balance the forces acting on the hull. Without the lateen, a galleon would have struggled to change course efficiently. With it, a ship weighing 500 tons or more could pivot and respond to its helm in ways that seemed impossible for something so massive. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds, grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. In addition to the mast-mounted sails, galleons carried a sprit sail on a yard extending forward from the bowsprit, a long spar that jutted out over the water at the bow. The sprit sail helped the ship fall off the wind, turning the bow away from the wind direction, which was essential for tacking, the zigzag maneuver sailing ships used to make progress against headwinds. The total sail area on a large galleon could exceed 10,000 square feet. Managing all of that canvas required a small army of specialized sailors. Every sail was controlled by ropes collectively called the running rigging, allowing the crew to raise sails, lower them, angle them to catch the wind, and reef them during storms. The standing rigging, a separate set of fixed ropes and cables, supported the masts themselves, preventing them from toppling under the enormous forces generated by wind in the sails. The tension had to be precisely calibrated. Too loose, and the masts would sway dangerously. Too tight, and the rigging would snap or crack the mast step, the socket where the mast's base locked into the keel structure. The steering system on a galleon evolved significantly over the ship's 200-year lifespan. Early galleons used a tiller, a long wooden beam attached directly to the rudder and running forward through a hole in the stern into the hull. The helmsman pushed the tiller left to turn right and right to turn left. The problem was leverage. On a large galleon, the forces on the rudder were so immense that a single man couldn't move the tiller. Later, galleons introduced the whipstaff, a vertical lever connected to the tiller that gave the helmsman a mechanical advantage. And by the late 1600s, the ship's wheel had been invented, using a drum and rope system to translate the wheel's rotation into tiller movement with far greater precision and far less effort. Navigation on a galleon was equal parts science, art, and guesswork. The navigator's primary tools were the compass, the astrolabe or cross-staff for measuring the angle of celestial bodies above the horizon, and dead reckoning, the practice of estimating position based on speed, direction, and time. Speed was measured by dropping a log tied to a knotted rope over the stern and counting how many knots ran out in a set period, which is why ship speed is still measured in knots today. Direction came from the compass, though navigators knew that magnetic north wasn't the same as true north and had to account for the difference, called declination. Latitude, the north-south position, could be determined with reasonable accuracy by measuring the height of the sun at noon or the altitude of Polaris at night. Longitude was a different story entirely. There was no reliable way to determine east-west position at sea until the marine chronometer arrived in the 1700s, more than a century after the galleon's golden age. Galleons crossing the Pacific or the Atlantic were essentially navigating blind in one dimension. They knew how far north or south they were, but could only estimate how far east or west they had traveled. Mistakes cost lives. Ships ran onto reefs, missed islands entirely, or sailed past their destinations by hundreds of miles. Despite these navigational limitations, galleons made some of the most ambitious ocean crossings in maritime history. And the most extraordinary of all was the Manila galleon route. Starting in 1565, Spanish galleons sailed from Acapulco on the Pacific coast of Mexico to Manila in the Philippines, a distance of roughly 8,000 miles. They carried silver from the mines of Mexico and Peru, which was traded in Manila for Chinese silk, porcelain, spices, and other luxury goods. The return voyage was even longer. Because the prevailing winds in the tropics blew from east to west, the galleons couldn't simply sail straight back. Instead, they had to sail north from Manila, climbing up to the latitudes where the westerly winds blew, sometimes reaching as far north as Japan, and then riding those winds east across the entire Pacific to the coast of California before turning south to Acapulco. The return trip could take 6 months or more. The Manila galleon trade continued for 250 years, from 1565 to 1815. It was one of the longest and most profitable trade routes in history, and it was made possible entirely by the galleon's combination of cargo capacity, seaworthiness, and durability. No other ship type of the era could have survived those crossings with any consistency. The distances were too great, the storms were too violent, the calms could last weeks, and the cargoes were too valuable to trust to anything but the most capable vessel available. The treasure fleets that sailed between Spain and the Americas were equally dependent on the galleon. Twice a year, fleets of galleons gathered in Havana, loaded with gold, silver, emeralds, tobacco, cocoa, and other colonial products, and set sail for Spain in convoy formation. The convoys were escorted by dedicated warship galleons, purpose-built fighting machines that sailed on the flanks and in the rear, watching for pirates and enemy warships. The treasure the fleets carried was staggering. A single large galleon could carry cargo worth millions in modern currency. The entire fleet might represent a significant percentage of the Spanish crown's annual revenue. This is why pirates targeted galleons, not because they were easy prey, but because they were worth the risk. Capturing a treasure galleon was like winning the lottery. The problem was that galleons were designed to fight back. Their gun decks could deliver devastating broadsides. Their crews were trained for combat. Their reinforced hulls could absorb punishment that would sink lesser ships. Most pirates preferred smaller, less well-defended merchants rather than tangle with a galleon. The ones who did, men like Francis Drake and Thomas Cavendish, became legends precisely because the feat was so dangerous. The construction of a galleon was a massive undertaking that involved entire communities. The major shipbuilding centers, Seville and Cadiz in Spain, Lisbon in Portugal, Havana in Cuba, and later the Philippines, employed hundreds of workers for each vessel. The process began with the selection and seasoning of timber, a step that alone could take 2 to 3 years. Green wood would shrink and warp as it dried, causing leaks and structural failures. Properly seasoned timber, air-dried for at least 2 years, was dimensionally stable and resistant to rot. Oak was the preferred material for hulls and structural members, prized for its hardness, durability, and resistance to water damage. Pine was used for masts and yards because of its straight grain and flexibility. Elm was used for components that would be permanently submerged, like the keel and lower hull planking, because elm resisted rot better than oak when constantly wet. And tropical hardwoods like teak and mahogany were used in galleons built in Asian and Caribbean shipyards, where European species weren't available, but local alternatives were equally suitable. The workforce included master shipwrights who designed and supervised construction, carpenters who shaped the timbers, sawyers who cut the lumber, caulkers who sealed the hull, rope makers who produced miles of cordage, sailmakers who cut and stitched canvas, blacksmiths who forged thousands of iron fittings, and laborers who hauled and assembled the components. A large galleon might take 12 to 18 months to build, with a construction crew of 200 or more. The cost was enormous. A fully equipped galleon could cost the equivalent of millions in today's money. The hull itself was the largest expense, but rigging, sails, armament, provisions, and crew added substantially. Sails alone were a significant investment, requiring thousands of square feet of canvas, hand-stitched with reinforcing seams and rope-bolt ropes around the edges. Sails wore out quickly at sea, chafed by rigging, battered by wind, and rotted by salt spray, so galleons carried spare sails and repair materials. Living conditions aboard a galleon were brutal by modern standards. The crew slept in shifts, sharing hammocks or simply lying on the deck. Food consisted of hardtack, a type of rock-hard biscuit that could last for months, but often arrived at the table infested with weevils. Salt beef and salt pork were the primary protein sources, preserved in barrels of brine that sometimes failed, leaving the meat rancid and crawling with maggots. Fresh water was stored in wooden casks that grew slimy and foul-tasting within weeks. Beer was often preferred because the alcohol inhibited bacterial growth, though it didn't last much longer than water in tropical heat. Disease was the galleon sailor's constant companion. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was the worst killer. On long voyages, sailors' gums would swell, their teeth would loosen, old wounds would reopen, and eventually they would die. The Manila galleon route was particularly devastating. On some crossings, half the crew died of scurvy before reaching port. It wasn't until the late 1700s that the British Navy proved citrus juice could prevent the disease, and even then it took decades for the practice to spread. Dysentery, typhus, and tropical fevers claimed additional lives. The cramped, unsanitary conditions aboard ship were perfect breeding grounds for disease. Rats infested the hold, contaminating food stores. Fleas and lice were universal, and the medical options were primitive, limited to the ship's surgeon, often a barber by trade with minimal training, wielding a saw and a bottle of rum. Despite all of this, men volunteered. The pay was modest, the conditions terrible, and the risks enormous. But the potential rewards were real. Ordinary sailors on a successful treasure fleet voyage could earn bonuses that exceeded a year's wages on land. Officers and captains could become wealthy. And for men with no prospects in the rigid class structures of 16th and 17th century Europe, the sea offered something land rarely did: a chance. The galleon's dominance began to fade in the late 1600s and early 1700s as new ship designs emerged. The ship of the line, a pure warship with multiple gun decks, replaced the galleon in fleet battles. The frigate, faster and more maneuverable, took over patrol and escort duties, and new merchant vessel designs, optimized for cargo rather than combat, proved more economical for trade routes now better protected by standing navies. But the galleon's influence persisted long after the last one was broken up for timber. The principles galleon builders pioneered, the use of mathematical proportions to design hull shapes, the integration of weapons into the ship's structure, the balance between cargo capacity, speed, and firepower, became the foundation of naval architecture for centuries. The ship of the line was essentially a galleon scaled up with more guns. The clipper ships of the 1800s used hull proportions galleon designers would have recognized instantly. And the galleon's cultural legacy is arguably even larger than its technical one. When people imagine the age of exploration, they imagine galleons. When they picture the Spanish Armada, they picture galleons. When they think of pirate stories and buried treasure, the ship in their mind's eye is always a galleon. That three-masted silhouette on the horizon, billowing sails and rows of cannon, has come to symbolize an entire era of human history. The reason for that isn't nostalgia. It's because the galleon genuinely represented something remarkable. In an age before steam engines, before steel hulls, before computers or GPS or weather satellites, human beings designed and built a vessel from nothing but wood, canvas, rope, and iron that could cross any ocean on Earth, survive the worst storms nature could throw at it, fight off attackers, carry enough cargo to fund an empire, and return home months later for another voyage. That's not just shipbuilding. That's engineering at its most ambitious, most creative, and most consequential. The Galleon didn't just sail the oceans, it connected them. It linked continents that had never traded before. It carried the silver that fueled global commerce and the spices that transformed European cooking. It brought cultures into contact for better and worse, and shaped the political map of the modern world. Every plank in its hull chosen by hand, every rope in its rigging twisted by human fingers, every sail was stitched by candlelight, and every voyage was a bet against the ocean, placed by men who understood how slim the margins were between survival and catastrophe. The Galleon was never just a ship. It was the machine that built the modern world. And the engineers who designed it, whose names are mostly lost to history, accomplished something that deserves admiration 400 years later. They took the raw materials the Earth provided, wood and wind, and they turned them into a vessel that conquered the planet. That's the story of the Galleon, not a pirate ship, not a museum piece, a masterpiece of engineering that changed everything.